when I first got wind of what was going on in Washington State, I basically was like, that's sad from a perspective of charter schools, and it's troubling. But it doesn't really apply to Idaho, because Idaho is a red state, a conservative state. There's strong political support for charter schools and choice in this state. We saw that on the steps today. We know that through survey work that the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Family Foundation has done, that there's strong public support for charter schools. And so I felt good about that part of it, being in this space. But in talking to Tom and Chris and Todd and others, there are the courts, and there are things that can happen through the courts that can be very different sometimes to what maybe happens legislatively. And that was what led us to this conversation. And so, fortunately for you all, I'm not going to say very much. I just want to say my admiration and respect for these two and what they've put up with in terms of the struggle to start a charter school program, to get it going, to get kids into the schools, to do it really well, and then to have the court come down and say it's unconstitutional and you've got to stop. And they said, no, we're going to keep doing it, and they have been doing it. I mean, they deserve a round of applause for the fact that what they've put up with here. And they are our friends from next door. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with Chris. And Chris, I got to know when things looked really great in Washington, and met a few times, and we were talking about are there ways we can work together across the state lines and that sort of thing. And she, we'll say more about herself and what the history is, but she was the one who got the first charter law done in Washington State. And then Tom came in, kind of like me, dropped in from a different state into Washington, was brought in to help grow great charter schools, build a strong voice, and then all this stuff happened, and that's kind of consumed his life, and I don't know if he now sleeps there at all or not. And then we have Todd Zebarth from the National Alliance, and he's going to kind of tell us what's going on elsewhere in the country and some of the things that are popping up in the United States that we need to be aware of and be thoughtful about before they happen. And so I think with that, I'll just say, Chris, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks. All right. Hi, everybody. Wow, that post-lunch thing is so great. You know it's a great post-lunch thing when your speakers are drinking the coffee. Thank you all for the invitation to be here, and congratulations to you on the great work you've done to give families and kids more choice in their education. It is a model and that we look to lovingly from the other side of the border, and a little bit with of envy at the moment, given the state that we're in. I'm the chief executive of an organization called the League of Education Voters. The League has been around for about 15 years. We're a statewide advocacy organization focused on excellent outcomes for our kids from early learning through college. My organization's roots were in education funding, but we've become more versatile in terms of accountability and where the money goes, and in investing in best practice, and also in innovation. And the innovation part of that menu is what brought us to the charter conversation. And so the League has been around for 15 years. I've been there for almost 9. I'm also a transplant, DC via Wisconsin, so a little bit of politics all over the place. Terry's very kind and gracious in saying that I did the charter bill. Nobody does a bill on their own. The League was a part of a coalition that brought the charter issue to the ballot in 2012. They say that the third time's the charm, and actually it turns out it's the fourth time that's the charm. This is the fourth attempt to pass an initiative, a charter initiative in Washington. And in a state that is, I think, largely seen as liberal and blue, it was not the easiest of lifts, and in large part because our people don't understand what choice means. They don't know what they're missing, and they haven't been exposed to it. So we had to let them know what a good charter school could look like, and what other options could look like for their kids that were free to them and didn't require them to pay for private school tuition. So in the 2012 ballot initiative arena, we raised and spent almost $13 million to pass an initiative by 41,682 votes out of 3 million cast. Less than a percentage point separated us from the jaws of defeat. If you think about the $13 million and the $3 million and the 3 million voters, I like to say we could have taken everybody to Disney World and we might have gotten more votes, but we passed it nonetheless. And it passed in large part because we were able to explain to people that what charter schools were and that what they were missing, and what some of our kids, while some of our kids do well in the traditional system, many of them don't. Many of them don't thrive, and they need and they deserve other options. And the charter school arena was a place for them was a possible place for them to go. So we win by the hair on our chinny chin chin, and we start building an infrastructure. We start by building a charter association that Tom is now the chief executive of, and start building out a sector. And so our charter law allows for 40 schools over 5 years. There's dual authorizing. There's a state commission that authorizes, and then school districts can also apply to become authorizers, and then out of the 295 school districts in Washington, ultimately only one opted to do so, and that's your neighbor across the way, Spokane. So we began the authorizing environment, and we began to look at how we can support the sector and what a healthy and vibrant and successful sector would look like, and realize that while on the political side we were able to build a lot of will, we also needed to build a lot of capacity in terms of people who were interested and willing to begin schools, and also capacity in the commission itself to understand what quality looks like. So we spent a fair amount of time, keeping in mind I run an organization, and I was part-time running the association while we were doing the search, and trying to build out this sector that was nascent and still not beloved. I mean, when you win by less than a percentage point, it's not like it's not like it's the most popular issue. So we had to continue to educate people about what these charter schools could be, and we're doing that in the absence of the schools existing, which made it very, very difficult. So it was really important to us that we start to build up some momentum, build the will, build the knowledge base for what those schools could be, and to build would-be charter leaders. And the association built out a part of its work that was leadership development, and worked with school leaders to design and launch their schools and apply to the commission. We were rolling along swimmingly. The commission authorized seven schools in the first, was it 7 or 8, Tom? 7 schools in the first year, one of which opened almost immediately, which we can talk about separately. It was a private school converted to a charter, and the others took a planning year. So they were busy working to get their schools in order, to do recruiting, to find facilities, which is no easy thing. We have no facilities funds. So our school leaders are busy building out their plans and finding facilities and hiring up staff, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, a court case makes its way from King County to the Supreme Court, from a superior court to the Supreme Court, brought by the League of Women Voters, which is confusing to folks when I tell them I'm from the League of Education Voters. We're on the opposite side of this, and our Teachers Association. So we won in Superior Court largely, except on one issue around school facilities funds, and they appealed immediately and went to the Supreme Court. And there it sat for nearly a year. And so, we kept, we were going on the adage that no news is good news. We just kept building out the sector, working again to open schools in the late summer, early fall of 2015. And lo and behold, we did have schools open. 1,100 kids started going to new schools in August of last year, schools that they were excited about, and schools, importantly, that they chose. They weren't assigned to these schools. These were the places that they wanted to be and that their parents wanted them in. There was a lot of excitement around it. So our kids were in school for nearly 3 weeks when our Supreme Court, not knowing apparently that school was already open, issued their decision. Typically their decisions would come out on a Thursday. This one was saved for Friday, the day before the day that Labor Day weekend began, at 4:30, 4:45, and it was devastating. It found that our schools were unconstitutional, and I'll let Tom talk a little bit about the specifics of that, and that they were not eligible for common school funds, that there was no funding mechanism for those schools, and therefore those schools are not viable and should be shut down. You can imagine just the panic that created, not only for our kids and our parents, but for our school leaders and our teachers, and for our communities who have longed forever for something else to choose than a system that hadn't been doing very well by that same group of kids. And all of a sudden, that thing that we'd all fought so hard for was ripped from our grasp. But your hero never takes off their cape, and come to find out, Tom never sleeps. We've been busy ever since, working to keep those schools open, alive, and vibrant, and not just for this year, but with a future, so that we can continue to open schools, continue to enroll our kids, and have a sector that grows and is vibrant, so that our students have choice like you have here in Idaho. So with that, I'm setting the context for the fact that it took us almost 20 years to establish a sector. It took one court decision to rip it away from us, and now we're fighting to maintain and reclaim that option. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing and the outcomes of the court's decision. And for that, I'm gonna turn it to Tom, who's been the person on point for that for what must seem like 40 years at this point, but it's really been about 6 months. So Tom.
Thanks, Chris. So just as a bit of background to sort of couch my the angle at which I approach this, I am an attorney by trade. I was representing school districts in New York before I sort of made the switch over to the dark side to work for the SUNY Charter Schools Institute, which we have somebody from NACSA here to confirm that they're the best authorizer in the country. So I'm happy about that. From there, I sort of made another switch back the other way and went to the authorizing shop in Minneapolis for a district within the school district. And I sort of went into it thinking that all of the things that we were doing right in New York were things that were founded in best practice and sort of tied together with the right people. You're able to do the things that you want to do. And what I quickly found in Minneapolis was there are bureaucratic machines that stand in your way. There are political machines that continue to stand in your way. It was something that was always preventing us from meaningfully moving forward. We had the right ideas, we had the right people, but we didn't have the structure to push it forward. We were a relatively small authorizer in the state, and we just didn't have the political muscle to do what was ultimately necessary. And so I looked west, as many of us did at some point in our lives, and saw an opportunity in Washington to really build something from the ground up. Excuse me. When I got to Washington about 2 years ago, the Leadership Center that Chris had mentioned was well on its way of producing its first crop of leaders. We're already working on our second crop of leaders that graduating from our program. Every school leader that's gone through our program has gotten their school approved. So I think that's something that we're really proud of, that we're able to do that. And that we're able to do it not just sort of getting schools approved for the sake of approving schools, but in the entire process, we're building in quality as well. In the back of my mind, though, everything's sort of going pretty swimmingly, but you know that there's this court case that Chris mentioned that was filed. The National Alliance even wrote a paper on that court case, sort of analyzing it from the perspective of here's a challenge to a charter law that has been brought. The exact same challenge has been brought in many states. In every single one of those states, it was soundly defeated. So we're going forward with the perspective, we're at least 10 for 10 at that point. We're gonna make it 11 for 11, and we're gonna continue going on, just business as usual. One of the things that we did recognize, we recognized we had a vulnerability in the initiative, and I think that's one of the things that we could probably go back to, of just the nature of passing a charter law by virtue of a voter initiative versus having it pushed through by a friendly legislature. There are compromises that need to be made. Some things that would be considered best practice or things that you would want to see happen, we couldn't do in Washington because that would impact the electability of the initiative. So we recognized that there were some vulnerabilities, and we went to a couple of our charter champions, and we were able to get a small provision put into our budget to ensure that any money that was flowing to the schools that would be opening in the fall would not be constitutionally restricted common school dollars. So we were sort of at the point where we were confident that we were going to win, and we thought doing everything that was ultimately necessary to ensure that even if the court said we can't access those funds, we still have a pathway to be funded and be okay. In that context, it was a team of lobbyists, essentially. It was me, it was Chris, it was other partner organizations that were going to our key legislators and saying, hey, this is a vulnerability that we see, and we need you guys to step up and do something about it quickly. And they were able to do that. In the back of our minds, we sort of knew that at some point in the future, we've got a relatively low charter cap. We've got some other issues that we want to resolve in our law. We're going to need to build an advocacy machine. Thinking that the process that we just went through to get this single line of text thrown in the state budget isn't going to get us the cap lifted. It isn't going to get us more autonomy. It isn't going to get us better accountability provisions. We needed that advocacy machine. So we were just beginning to build that on September 4th, thinking that we had 4 years to really meaningfully worry about lifting the cap. But we were sort of at the starting point of recognizing there's a process that needs to happen if we're meaningfully going to advance this policy beyond where it is right now. And that's sort of when the decision hit. September 4th, as Chris mentioned, most of my team had already left to go away for Labor Day weekend. We called everybody back in. We worked near nonstop for at least the next 2 or 3 weeks. And one of the things that I did on September 5th, this is something I didn't consult with my board, and Chris is sitting here as one of my board members. I made a promise to our schools and got on a conference call and said there's going to be a lot of uncertainty over the coming weeks, months, and the rest of the school year, but I guarantee we will find money to keep you open. And I said that not having raised a dime to be able to do that. But I think one of the things that we recognized early on is that in going into this advocacy fight, we are not going to win the fight if we're advocating on behalf of empty buildings. The entire fight, the entire struggle that Chris described of failed initiatives, of past votes in Washington by the legislature that were rejected by initiatives, every single one of those efforts ultimately failed because it was always a discussion about a concept. And it was a concept where a very strong opposition was always able to push back against us. Now, for the first time, we have kids and families being served. We have the vast majority of the students being served in our sector are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. We 70% students of color. We're exceeding district averages as far as serving kids with disabilities and serving kids with limited English proficiency. We're absolutely serving the kids that we want to serve and that we said we were going to serve. And all of the preliminary data that we have up until this point says that we're serving them well. So we knew that we had to sort of keep these folks engaged, and we've been able to do that. Just to elaborate a little bit more on the court decision, I think this is something we'll probably come back to a little bit more later as well. Ultimately, what the glitch was is Washington is not a local control state. There are a handful of states in the country that are absolutely local control states where local districts have absolute authority over what goes on in those districts. Washington is not one of them. However, there is a 1909 court decision in the state of Washington where the state Supreme Court basically kind of inferred that we are a local control state. And we ran headlong into that single decision. And what that was based on was this notion of what common schools are. Washington has a provision in our state constitution that says the legislature shall provide for a system of common schools. This is a relatively common provision across the country. Roughly half the states in the country, including the state of Idaho, have common school provisions in their state constitution. And they basically said, because we are not governed by a locally elected board, as is every other common school, we are therefore not a common school. We cannot access those funds that are designated for common schools. We are therefore unconstitutional. So it was what I think, based on all the research that the National Alliance did, my experience as an attorney, it was quite a stretch, but it was a stretch that they were willing to take to essentially cut us off at the knees. Since then, we have been able to uphold our promise. We have raised the funds to keep our schools open. First and foremost, through continued legal action, we were able to buy an additional couple of months from the Supreme Court to keep public funding flowing. That cut off as of December 10th, I believe. Since then, the schools have transitioned to what are called alternative learning experience programs. This is a provision in our state law that we're by and large taking advantage of, that is intended to allow mostly rural districts to serve kids through online education. And we have latched onto that and allowed our schools to stay open as ALEs. That comes at significantly reduced per pupil apportionment. Keep going. So with that reduced funding, we have raised and dedicated to schools roughly $7 million to make sure that each one of these schools remains open through the current school year and is able to continue offering the exact same academic program that they offered to families in the beginning of the year. At the same time all that's going on, we are running a formal campaign as well. Shortly after the decision, we created a 501c4 organization that is able to do unlimited lobbying. In my spare time, completely unrelated to anything to do with the C3, a political action committee was also formed to begin the political work that needs to happen to make sure that we're thanking our friends in the legislature as early and as often as possible, and also to begin preparing ourselves for that longer term fight of ensuring that we have the right faces in Olympia to do the things that we're going to need to do in the future. At this point, I would say that I'm reasonably and cautiously optimistic about our chances in this current legislative session. It's not going to get us the initiative, though. There will be compromises. We will take steps backwards. So we have to look at this as a long-term fight. And are we setting up that apparatus and that mechanism, which is not only going to get us the win here in the next 2 months, but be able to sustain the movement from an advocacy perspective for the foreseeable future. So as I said, there's cautious optimism, but we're going to barely hang on at best. So what we all want to see is what's the belt and what's the suspenders? What are our backup options? And I think from my perspective, looking across the border and all the great things you guys have done with your nearly 50 schools now, and the opportunity that exists in Idaho, I'd be thinking about the same kinds of things. Everything's good right now. You're one decision away, just like we were and we will be in the future. So what are you doing to sort of pressure test your law? Make sure that you have the belt and the suspenders on, and make sure that you're adequately prepared for whatever challenges may come down the road, and that your advocacy apparatus, probably I'd assume through Terry, is appropriately set up to take on that challenge when it comes. So I want to turn it over to Todd to sort of give the national perspective.
Tom, can I ask just one thing?
Sure.
This is an important part of the story, I think, is that when that court decision came down, it wasn't just the charter schools that were going to lose funding. There were others, and this is where I'm murky in my memory on this, but there were other programs, long-standing programs. Maybe you can just say a little bit about that, and has that been an odd bedfellows kind of thing? Has it been, say just a little?
Yeah, so in turning to this 1909 decision, what the court basically used as its litmus test for whether or not a school is a common school, that 1909 court basically rested its decision on the notion that there was a locally elected board that had the authority to hire and fire teachers directly as the board. So it didn't talk about delegation to the superintendent. It didn't talk about bargaining away rights or anything like that. It was a locally elected board that can hire and fire teachers directly. If that is to be our litmus test in the state of Washington, there are many academic programs that receive common school funding, but no locally elected board can hire or fire them. So we have actual ALE programs, so there are online providers that would fall into that category. There are running start programs that allow students to, earn college credit while in high school. These are contracted out with local colleges, classes taught by college professors that can't be hired or fired by locally elected boards. There are schools for the gifted and talented, schools for the deaf and blind. Tribal compact schools is a relatively new statutory creation in the state of Washington to allow the Indian reservations to have a very charter-like system. I mean, the tribal compact law is based on our charter law. All of these programs received funding in the same exact manner as we did prior to September 4th. And so this court has sort of thrown all of those other programs in harm's way potentially. So the legislation that we are currently working on and supporting in Olympia protects some but not all of those programs. But I think that's sort of a longer term issue for us of making sure that, and I think this sort of is more on Chris's plate than it is mine, being in a sort of solely charter-focused place whereas Chris has a more global look on the delivery of public education in Washington as a whole. Are we going to be able to continue to provide all of those necessary services and programs to students in a world where a court is being this restrictive around what can and can't be
So in effect,
done?
you've gone back to 1909, and this is how you're supposed to make it work in 2016 and beyond.
Well, yeah, essentially, we're living in a 1909 world. I think it's important, one additional piece on that issue around the other educational systems is that the court didn't expressly include them in their decision. The court was pretty clear that they were talking specifically about charter schools. And so it's the opinion of the folks who represent those other entities, and it would be my opinion if I were representing them, that they're not included because they weren't expressly listed. They weren't defined as part of this, what I call the pot of misery. You know, I wanted to grow the pot of misery. I wanted more miserable people in that pot so that we would have a better chance of growing a movement and having a coalition effort. But the court didn't go there. The court was very clear. This is about charter schools and charter schools only. That being said, if you just apply their reasoning to those institutions in a court case, there's almost no way you could come to any other conclusion but that they are also outside of that 1909 ruling. So they're a court case away from disaster, just like we were.
So Todd, coming at
Just,
Tom,
I think one more important thing to point out on the decision is we had a statewide independent authorizer in the Washington State Charter School Commission that was able to authorize schools anywhere in the state. And then a process by which any district could apply to the State Board of Education and basically say, here's how we are going to carry out and implement best practices as defined by NACSA to open up an authorizing shop and create schools of our own. In Washington, only one district went entirely through that, the Spokane district right on the other side of the border. And by all indications, they were doing a fantastic job. When the decision first came down on September 4th and we read it, the first thing that popped into everybody's mind is, what about Spokane? Here's a locally elected board that went through the exact process that was laid out by the people in the initiative. They had oversight responsibility and held those schools accountable. Why are they being looped in and lumped in with everyone else that was authorized by the commission? So that was the primary basis of our motion for reconsideration to the Supreme Court. And we sort of laid everything out of, hey guys, don't forget about Spokane, they're doing a good job out there too. And when the final decision ultimately came from the court, they chose not to address it at all. So we're sort of acting, how do we move forward in the best way possible without having had any meaningful guidance from the court as to what they even believe are the critical tenets that we have to follow. Everything about that decision told us Spokane should have been fine. Right. And now we're trying to draft a law that assumes Spokane wasn't fine for some unknown reason. And I think it just presents a tremendous challenge for us in crafting something that will ultimately withstand constitutional scrutiny as well. Because I think the bottom line is our legislative session ends on March 11th. I doubt we'll get through the end of March before we're back in court again.
So we'll come back to Washington because it's a tragic story, and the people who had the charter commission staff left like a week after this decision came down. They were defunded and they left, and so the schools are trying to figure out how we held it, what accountability, who's accountable for what, who's accountable for the money, I can only imagine just the craziness around this. Can we switch gears a little bit and come back? And I really want people to ask questions. So Todd, all right, give us kind of the landscape here nationally. you got to spend the day here in Idaho. You got to see the folks on the steps. You've been able to meet with some lawmakers. You sense there's a pretty strong support here for charters and chartering and choice more generally. But when you guys kind of look at the maps and think about this from a legal court perspective, what do you see for Idaho and for other states, and what are some of the other threats that are coming up? I know there are things happening in Minnesota, there are things happening all over.
So there are a number of threats, I think, facing charter schools across the country that you may not be feeling in Idaho at the moment because of your strong legislative support or the strong history of growth of charters in the state, but they're good things to be aware of, just as sort of a heads up that this may be coming to your state soon. Obviously, the biggest thing that I'll start off talking about are the implications of the Washington decision. When the decision was first announced, our instinct was to say it's a liberal court in a blue state relying on a 1909 court case. This has no applicability anywhere else.
And an important note,
Yes.
elected justices
Elected
who
justices.
received a lot of money from
Right.
traditional groups.
So that made us feel good for about 5 minutes, and then we realized that charter opponents were taking the decision and dissecting it and figuring out where to go next to challenge charter schools. So we basically said we have to assume that folks who don't like charters are going to use this decision to create a lot of noise, a lot of havoc about the constitutionality of charters in other states. Even if they don't get a lot of traction, there's going to be a lot of noise out there around this decision. So what we did is we assembled some legal experts to really do an analysis of the decision and really pull out what are the key risk factors based upon that decision that we need to be applying to other states to figure out who's at risk here for the next court case. As Tom said, in every other state where the constitutionality of the charter law as a whole has been brought forward, we've always won. So this is the first time that we lost, and so we really wanted to figure out where might folks go next with this. So some of the risk factors are some of the concepts at the heart of the case, the ones that Tom mentioned, like local control, common schools, uniformity. Are these embedded in other state constitutions and in their case law? A second risk factor is the state court system, the Supreme Court, active on public education issues? Do they have a history of getting really involved in school funding cases or other public education cases, which indicates a willingness to perhaps get involved on this issue? A third is there insufficient legal history in the state around charter schools? Has there been litigation on the constitutionality of the charter law or parts of the charter law, or has there been much litigation at all to establish in court whether charters are public schools? And then the last thing that we look at as a risk factor is, are there non-district authorizing entities like the Idaho Charter School Commission that are active in a state? And so we did a very sort of surface application of that to all of the states with charter laws and the states without charter laws, and determined that Idaho on the surface is a state that we probably want to do some more due diligence. And I think it's sort of a bad news, good news. The bad news is on the surface, you know, Idaho looks to be at risk, but as we do more due diligence, we think that it probably isn't as at risk in the way you would think just on the surface analysis. On the Idaho constitutional language, a provision in and of itself gave us heartburn. I'll just read it real quickly. The stability of a Republican form of government depending mainly upon the intelligence of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislature of Idaho to establish and maintain a general, uniform, and thorough system of public, free, common schools. Very similar language to Washington State in some ways. And so that gave us heartburn. There's a history of school funding litigation in Idaho, which indicates the Idaho Supreme Court is more than happy to get involved on public education policy issues. There's a common school fund here that funds schools. And then, as I mentioned, there's assertive non-district authorizing. So that's sort of the bad news. I think the good news is that the Idaho Supreme Court has chosen to define common schools in a way different than Washington State. So this whole notion of having to be controlled by locally elected boards as the end-all be-all is not a factor here. And I think more importantly, the court has explicitly rejected the Bryan case from Washington. It's a rather famous case that was at the heart of the decision in Washington that has been referenced in other state courts over the years, and Idaho is one of the few places, my understanding, where the court has actually rejected the rationale there. So that gave us some comfort as well. So what we're continuing to do due diligence with Terry and his team and others to make a more, I think, final determination on it. But I think at the end of the day, the question that really needs to be asked and answered is, what does it mean to be a public, free, common school in Idaho? And is the law written in such a way where charters are clearly meeting those obligations? Just, as a way to protect yourself against, mischief that opponents might do in the future. So that's, I think, a big takeaway from the Washington case in Idaho going forward. There's some other legal threats that I wanted to mention that we're seeing in other states. One has to do around enrollment issues. Folks have brought challenges in places like Minnesota where they feel charters are contributing to the resegregation of public education, and which really calls into question the autonomy of charter schools to be able to create and implement their own enrollment policies, target the types of students that they think their program will best serve. So that is a relatively new development in that state and one to keep an eye on. In a couple of other places, folks have brought some lawsuits claiming that charter schools aren't serving kids with special needs appropriately. Recently in New York City, one of the high-profile networks there, Success Academies, there's some challenges being brought around their alleged lack of sufficient service of special education. And then in Louisiana as well, it was part of a broader lawsuit against the state in New Orleans, again claiming as part of that charters weren't adequately serving kids with special needs. So I think in both of those cases, again, I think it would just trigger an analysis here in Idaho around how our charters doing in terms of segregating or integrating students. Are they putting in place policies to try to reach all kids, doing everything they can to try to serve all kids, but families are just making those choices? Or are charters doing things that might discourage certain families from attending and being served? I think those are important things to look at if you want to ward off a challenge. And I know there's been some, was there an Office of Civil Rights complaint filed here? Yes.
We had Renita and Norn.
Yeah.
A number of these folks were here for that. But
Yeah.
that's still out there. Nothing has happened with it.
Yep. Another legal challenge, and I know this is not as much of an issue in Idaho yet, I think, except maybe to our friends with Gem Prep, is that there's been some challenges from charter management organizations getting C3 status from the IRS, which has been a big problem as some of our high-performing schools have wanted to replicate and expand. I think we're confident that that's being kind of worked through, and we're getting better responses on it, but that's a threat really to the growth of some of our highest performing schools. And then funding. Our funding is sort of threatened from all angles, and in some states, folks have Louisiana in particular, have challenged how we're funded and whether or not it's legal in those places. And so that's something else to keep an eye on. The other thing I wanted to mention is just outside of the courtroom, we're under siege in a lot of places. Again, I know here in Idaho you probably don't feel it as much, but these are just some things to be aware of in terms of legislative threats. First of all, I think our opponents continue to try to put caps on our growth or moratoriums in place. They continue to try to cut our funding. I think those were sort of some older strategies that they've used that they haven't had a lot of success with, frankly. So they've moved on to some other things, some of which I think they're actually getting some traction on. They're trying to eliminate non-district authorizers, so eliminate the Idaho Commission or university authorizers and just house this all in local school districts, back to the local control issue. They've also tried to politicize the authorizing process, and so in some places they'll require districts to sign off on any applications that would go to the Idaho Commission, or they would require the Idaho Commission to basically find that a new school that was going to open up will have zero negative fiscal and academic impact on surrounding districts, which means that no charter school would ever open up. Because, you know, at the end of the day, charters do a lot of things, and there are a lot of purposes to them, and one of them, frankly, is to by drawing kids and dollars, hopefully motivate school districts to change their behavior to try to attract those kids again. So, so not only eliminating these non-district authorizers, but politicizing the process to make it so noisy that non-district authorizers would be hesitant to approve any new schools. And I think the place where they haven't got a lot of traction on those issues across the country. I think the place that they're probably getting the most traction is around re-regulation of charters. There was a report that came out from the Annenberg Institute about a year ago, I think September of 2014, which I highly recommend you read if you're concerned about these issues. It sort of outlines, you know, literally 70 recommendations I think they have to hold charters accountable. I think one of the clever things charter opponents have done is glom onto some language around accountability and transparency, because as you all know who do the work in the legislature, it's really hard to go in front of a legislative committee and say you don't want to be accountable or you don't want to be transparent. And the challenge is they've used those words and are, you know, trying to drive through policies that would really re-regulate charters in every kind of way, from enrollment to staffing to funding. And so, again, that report's from the Annenberg Institute. We've actually created a kind of point-by-point counter to it that if folks are interested, we're happy to share it with them. But my sense is in Idaho, you're probably not going to see caps or moratoriums or funding cuts or the elimination of non-district authorizers anytime soon. The re-regulation thing is probably the thing to most be aware of, particularly if it's dressed up around accountability and transparency. And I think there are other threats to the movement in terms of public relations. Right now, we're under siege in a lot of places around privatization, corporatization, for-profits, those kinds of things. And the other place where I think there's a threat to the movement is really within the movement, self-inflicted threats through either poor performance that's chronic, that's tolerated, that's not addressed, through financial scandals that get blown up and aren't dealt with and kind of linger out there in the newspaper for weeks and months. So we're obviously under threat from our opponents in a lot of different ways, but there's also threats within the movement that we need to be just as mindful of as well. And we actually have more control over dealing with that stuff.
So are there questions burning here that people want to ask? You want me to just start throwing out questions? Because this is really up to you all.
So the they in every state we've worked in are we often joke that charter schools unify the statewide teachers union, statewide school boards association, and the statewide administrators association. So when I say they, I'm referring to in typically those three groups oppose charter laws, they oppose improving them, they fight to weaken them almost uniformly. So that's the primary, when I say they, that's who I'm referring to. Yep.
And local control,
and I think,
Tom?
I think to that, I mean, I think I haven't heard of this necessarily existing in Idaho, but progressive, white, middle-class liberals. I mean, those that follow sort of the national education news and followed the race in California, like the same people that voted against Marshall Tuck and prevented him from being state super, like those same folks exist in large number along the I-5 corridor. And that's sort of where the League of Women Voters sits and has their power. And so the Washington State League of Women Voters, based in Seattle, takes a very different position than the League of Women Voters as they do in many places across the country. And it's this white, progressive, middle, upper class sort of group of people that I would lump in with those same other groups. As far as common schools, in the state of Washington, I would certainly defer to Terry and others here in Idaho and your council. In the state of Washington, it by and large comes down to the presence of a locally elected board capable of hiring and firing teachers. And this is, while it's super reassuring to hear that there's probably not an immediate threat for you, I mean, I think this, to me, and sort of dealing with what we're dealing with right now in the next state over, this is where you ought to be thinking, in my opinion, of the belt and suspenders approach. Of have you meaningfully looked at every single decision that talked about what a common school is, and are you 100% confident that you meet every single one of those classifications? If your Supreme Court at some time recognized that every common school in the state of Idaho gets a blue sticker, then you damn well better find a way to get a blue sticker. And now's the time to sort of do that when you have that friendly majority in place to be able to push those kinds of things through. Like, we thought we were moving in that direction with our little budget move this past spring. We didn't move far enough. We did not have the belt and suspenders that I think is ultimately going to be necessary to protect the movement from threat in the future.
The challenge, though, I think, or one of the challenges is you wouldn't want to be a common, I mean, I think ultimately if common school, I think the hope was that the court would be flexible in how it interpreted what a common school was in Washington, and instead they took a very restrictive view of it and said you had to be controlled by a locally elected school board. And so at the end of the day, you can't be a common school in Washington and be a charter school, right? And so I think the bill you guys are running now is saying their charters aren't common schools, and there's room in Washington state for schools other than common schools. So the challenge will be here in other states that define common schools as well is it too restrictive? Will it not allow charters the flexibility to hire and fire who they want, to have the curriculum that they want? And if that's the case, then you don't want to be a common school, and you have to think, does the Constitution allow for the legislature to create other types of public schools besides common schools? And a lot of states do that.
Right, that room to live outside if that's ultimately necessary. And I think that's absolutely the direction that we have to go in right now. We can no longer claim in any way, shape, or form to be common schools. So we, assuming we get this bill passed, we are going to be funded from the Washington Opportunities Pathways account. This is lottery dollars. And every biennium, we are going to be fighting for our lives to make sure that we are getting sufficient dollars allocated to us to keep our schools open. I mean, it's not an ideal position in any way,
Right.
shape, or form.
How do you deal with facilities and things like that? I mean, you have no certainty. How do you go to a lender and say, we want to do a 30-year deal to build a facility when every other year you may not get funded? I mean, I can only imagine as you guys start thinking about this that.
Good question.
Yeah, just one, but
no, I think, I mean, we've up until this point, we've had the benefit of some very strong, solid support from the philanthropic community. Notwithstanding that support and other guarantees, and I think in the absence of CSP dollars, in the absence of Walton startup funds, we as an association have gone out and raised money to give each of these schools very large startup grants to sort of cover some of these issues. All of that happening, we've only had one lender that has stepped in and been willing to take the risk. And I think that is a challenge that isn't going to go away for us. I think we're not necessarily resting on our laurels that the Washington Opportunities Pathway account is the end-all be-all for us. We have to think about alternate sources of revenue to make sure that we have the belt and suspenders at all times of those funds that never touch common school funds.
And to be clear on this, I think it's important to note that the support and the opponents of charters in Washington state are bipartisan. So you have Democrats and Republicans who support charters, or is this one of those all Republicans support charters, no Democrats? How would you describe the political landscape there?
one quick thing is, you know, we're referred to as a blue state, and people have that impression of us, and we're not quite red, but we're not entirely blue either. And there's a, you know, so we have our Senate is Republican, the House is marginally Democrat.
So you're purple.
We're purple, and, you know, we're going to be, you know, there's a good chance that by the end of, you know, November, we're going to be a lot closer to red than we are to blue, in terms of our legislature. That said, you know, we've found it in my organization to be beneficial when these issues are approached in a bipartisan way, because in Washington, power has transitioned back and forth in the chambers. And so if you're largely seen as a Republican cause while the Democrats are in charge, you're out of luck. And if you're largely seen as a Democrat, you know, cause where the Republicans are in charge, you're out of luck. So we're trying to find a way to make sure that we're working with everybody. The way that the votes came down, you know, we got a fair amount of support from Democrats, but not in the liberal parts of along the I-5 corridor, but but further south. And then we got a fair amount of support east of the mountains as well. So it did turn out to be a bipartisan vote, but we have opponents from both sides of the aisle as well. And, you know, we have to pay attention to what their issues are, and they're different. It's not one of those interesting things where the polar ends of the political spectrum find themselves somehow together for the same reasons. We've seen that on other issues, but they're just opposed, but they're opposed for different reasons. We have to find that middle ground. Most people live in the middle. Most of America, most of the voters live in the middle, and that's where this issue is. And we just have to make sure that we're speaking to them and that they're doing everything they can to reach out to the legislature so that they're living in the middle and operating from the middle too.
Blossom Johnston is asking a question from the J.A. and Catherine Family Foundation. There's an important question there, and that is the kids oftentimes get lost in this, and I've been tracking. You guys do a great job of sending out clips and stuff. I mean, one of the things you've done, I believe, really very well is that you've engaged families. You've had families at every single one of these conversations. You've had the kids. You've had, I mean, those are the faces that you see and you read a lot about, and I'm assuming that's had a powerful impact on what you're doing. These 1,200 kids that are at risk of being tossed out, they're actually in schools that they will say straight up are better than what we ever were going to before, and so this role of the families and kids and how's that playing out? I think, am I summarizing that?
Sure. So I would say the charter movement needs to do a number of different things. I think one is, building off that, is better organize our schools. Like it or not, this is a political fight. Charters are political creations. If legislators would have not passed laws, we would not exist. And so we're always at threat of going out of business, not just through a Supreme Court decision, but from a legislature saying, we've had enough, we're going to cap you, we're going to put a moratorium in place. It just happened in Delaware last year. No more charters in Wilmington. So, like it or not, it's a political fight, and so we have to probably talk about it a lot differently than we do. And I think one of the ways we do that is, and obviously you can't do it when you don't have schools, which was one of the challenges, but you have how many schools here, and you can begin to organize your parents, your students, your educators, your leaders. And it's not necessarily to go, fight, but it's really just to tell their stories. To me, the most compelling thing isn't us going and lobbying legislators. The most compelling thing is legislators hearing the huge difference that these schools are making in the lives of kids in their districts. So I think that on the political side of things, better organizing our schools will help a great deal. And then, I think charters were sort of the new kid on the block. Everybody liked them, at least in some places, for a while, and gotten a little complacent in media and elsewhere in terms of just being out there telling our story repeatedly. Because if we don't, we know our opponents are telling the opposite story. So I think we probably have to re-engage more aggressively in not just traditional media, but also social media. I think we're getting killed in social media. And I don't think that necessarily, I think it's more of a leading indicator. I don't think it's negatively impacting a whole lot now, but I think over time, if we keep getting killed in social media, it will begin to impact things in legislatures and elsewhere.
Can I ask a question, Tom?
Just as far as, I think the original question was around also sort of the support that's available for states and folks. As I look back to that Labor Day weekend, I think we were on the phone with folks from the National Alliance and NACSA and the National Alliance at least once every hour, of them sort of really stepping in and providing us support in crisis communications and organizing and stuff like that. And one of the things that I think when I talk about sort of the work that we are doing, that is work to facilitate a larger political machine. That machine is kids and families. Those are the folks that have allowed us to pass a good bill out of our state Senate. We have a ton of work to do in making sure we are organized enough to put their voices forward. And I think that's exactly what our plan has been all along. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of engaged parents from across the state, places that don't even have charter schools, coming to Olympia saying, when do I get my opportunity to have a great school for my kids? It's those folks and that diversity of voices that are really driving the conversation in Washington and allowing us to have the degree of confidence that we have right now.
Can you say something about Spokane? Because this is very interesting, because there are some districts in this state that are doing really good things with charter schools. And there's a representative of one here. There's a little district, Salmon, that's been doing some pretty innovative stuff, and some others. Help us understand. So the district there, why are they with you?
Spokane is sort of, as I look back early on, they recognized that their families wanted more options than they were able to provide. And they saw this charter law as an opportunity to do that. They recognized pretty early on that they didn't have the expertise in-house to be able to do it well. So they went out and hired and brought in some talented folks from California to run their authorizing shop. And they really put the effort in to understand what is it going to take to meaningfully deliver to our families, and what is it going to take to make sure that we're doing this in a way that allows only for the creation of high-quality schools. So, they took the exact approach that you would want to see a district take. At nearly every opportunity, even from an advocate's perspective, they erred on the side of quality. And that's all you can ever hope for in a movement that honestly has too little across the country. Ever since the decision came down, they've remained tremendously supportive of their schools. They've been proactive in trying to find solutions that would work for their schools. The first option was they stepped forward almost immediately and said, if you guys can't be a charter anymore, we will take you on as a contract school, and we'll keep your funding the same and do everything we possibly can to support you. Ultimately, that fell apart because the local union objected to it. But at every step of the way, the district has been fantastic. They've been individually supportive of the legislative efforts that have been going on in Olympia. They're one of the lone voices that have sort of stepped out from the broader coalition of school districts and district administrators and sort of the acronym soup of associations that represent those interests. But I think it's reflective of the politics in Eastern Washington. It's the folks that want choice. They want a say in what's happening with their kids.
More like Idaho.
Well, it's the politics, yes, but it goes back to what you were saying, which is that there's a superintendent who is absolutely committed to her kids. And it's not that 294 other superintendents in the state aren't committed to their kids. She's just willing to put all of her chips into the middle of the table and say, if we're gonna get hung up on politics, and while I'm trying to do the best thing for my kids, then come and get me. And that's the kind of leadership this takes. It takes courage, and it takes that conviction that if I'm doing things in the best interest of my kids, I'm willing to suffer whatever consequence politically you're gonna throw at me. And that's basically the position of that superintendent. And she's just a really rare combination of commitment and courage that you hope for in all leaders.
How do we get them to help inoculate ourselves?
I would just, realizing they're overstretched and burdened, I'd hate to add any more to their plate, but I think one simple thing is you could just invite your local legislators to visit your school. Whoever your rep and senators are, have them come into your school. I think that would, that's not a huge lift, and I think it would go a long way. I always find getting legislators into actual buildings can get supporters even more excited and can neutralize people who might otherwise be hostile to you. So I think just school tours for legislators could be helpful.
I think it's important not to mistake simple engagement of parents and kids and thinking that alone is enough. I think part of our role as leaders of this movement is to recognize that we collectively have to elevate those voices to places they ordinarily wouldn't reach. So we have a responsibility to not only sort of get parents out and kids out at functions, but to understand the stories and recognize a compelling story over a run-of-the-mill story. And when that compelling story exists, is the apparatus in place to ensure that that story gets shared with the right voices? And I think in the first couple of months of school in Washington, there was absolutely parent engagement. There was absolutely no mechanism or machine in place to get that to the ultimate decision makers. So I think at the school level, and I'll say this sort of never having been in those specific shoes, there's sort of the as I talk to our leaders, the self-preservation aspect that's always sort of present in what am I doing to protect my environment. There has to be a recognition among those leaders of not only protecting that environment, but protecting the ecosystem as a whole, and recognizing that there has to be a way that same story that you're going to put on your school Facebook page to sort of share with your local community is likely going to be compelling at the state capitol. And is there confidence in everybody in this room that there is that apparatus in place to make sure that those clear, compelling, critical stories are being shared, and that those parents, students, families, communities are the faces of the movement that are being represented.
Do you want to say anything, Chris?
Oh, I can't stress enough the need to make sure that your legislators come and visit your school when there's not a crisis. You have the luxury that you're not facing a threat. Do it now. Make sure that your relationship with them is solid now when you don't need anything. Because when you're knocking on their door trying to fight for your life, it's not the best time to create a relationship. So that's thing number. And then the other thing I would just offer is that your schools are full of parent leaders. There are a lot of leaders living and walking among your kids. They've found you, right? They put their kids there. There's a lot of talent there. So one thing not to overlook is how to tap into that talent in a way that doesn't tax your time further, but that builds out how much time you have because they're picking up the baton and running with it a little bit. Give them the baton and let them go. You'll be surprised, I think, and amazed at the power and the compassion and passion they'll bring to something. And it's ultimately, when you do have a crisis, it's ultimately their voice that's going to matter most anyway. and their kids' voice, right? So if we're building their capacity for that now, again, while there's not a crisis, you'll be in much better shape. If you run into something that is, that is threatening, or if you have an opportunity to do something great to add to the environment, you've got that infrastructure that's getting built.
I think that's a fantastic point that I want to elaborate on. And this sort of goes back to the don't mistake engagement for involvement. When the ruling came down, we had a listserv of sort of our contacts. We had about 4,000 or 5,000 names on it of folks that we were sort of in regular communication with. Since that time, we've more than tripled that list, and we've done it in a way that was very meaningfully intended not only to engage larger numbers, but also to educate about the issues. What's the why behind why we want you as a supporter? And so what we've seen as this community has grown over the last several months is there absolutely are the crazies out there that will say and do anything to oppose the growth of charter schools. As we have continued, and this, we're not done yet, but as we've continued to do a better and better job along the way of educating our parents about what the issues are once they do get engaged, they are the ones that are pushing back against those stories. The level of self-moderation that is happening out in the community without someone from the association or any of our contractors or any partners, parents with kids in these schools that are getting the benefit of these schools are shutting these arguments down. So I think it's critically important to have that happening and to have your parents know what those opportunities are to be engaged. But I think as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to, again, we have to go beyond just showing up at meetings. To meaningfully engage in those debates, they have to understand the issues.
So Todd, if I
just
can.
add on that, what I've observed is that the crazies aren't going to go away, but at least the people in the middle, to Chris's point, will have the contrasting reasonable viewpoint. Without that, they're just hearing from the crazies and they're thinking, maybe there's something to that. So I think you make a really good point. Just having that alternative voice out there helps people in the middle see what's rational and what isn't.
So Todd, I was at one of your conversations and you had a PR firm, I don't remember the name of the firm, and they showed, and I think I shared this with you and maybe others in this room, they showed the percentage of time, or I don't remember exactly how it went, but it was basically like in some states, Ohio, for every 10 negative things you heard about a charter, there was one good one. Ohio, it was 2 negative, to Idaho, it's 2 negative to 1 good one. We were actually in a pretty good space. But there's a lot going on. I mean, there's all these different voices out there. And I like to write. I write things. People say crazy things about me all the time. I don't know if anybody believes it or whatever, but, does it matter? How much does it matter? Because you guys have been keeping survey data and accumulating this. And I gather there's a shift in public opinion towards charter schools in America, away from charter schools in America. I don't know if that's true or not, but that would be what that data, if you looked at it, that would be one of the takeaways. But again, 2-to-1 negativity versus positive in Idaho, yet your survey work shows 80% of Idahoans support school choice. Can you give us some?
Yeah, so part of me says all of the activity on social media, and it is very much more anti than pro-charter, doesn't matter at all, because we're still able to pass laws, people still generally support us, but I think that's a pretty short-sighted viewpoint. I think long-term, if that stuff is allowed to continue to fester, I think we are going to have problems. I think you will see support start to drop. Right now, though, no, I think we're doing fine in most states. We're doing fine in terms of public support nationally, but I think that'll change if those numbers stay the way they are over a number of years.
So keep pushing back is what you're saying.
Start pushing back in the places you're not, and then increase where, the amount of pushback where we're pushing back already.
I think we took that survey data as a little bit of a point of pride in Washington, sort of going back to August, so before all of this happened, through the work that we had already been doing with our families and our media teams and things like that, we had the largest percentage of positive stories compared to negative. We had, I think it was 6 or 7 positive to every negative story. So we were able to flip that around. It ultimately didn't influence our Supreme Court, but I mean, I think it is possible to flip that if you're willing to put the work into it.
If you let your opposition define you, you lose. It's pretty much a pure fact of life. If you're defined by someone else, you lose. And so if you're not investing your time in establishing the terms of the debate, clarifying who and what you are and what you do, ultimately the white noise that's out there, the chatter, wins. And so while it might feel exhausting to have to do it, it has to be done. Does it have to be on a one-to-one? No, not necessarily. But you can't let mistruth sit because it becomes the truth. And that is a harsh reality. The other thing is that more and more people are getting their news from social media. So you know, we used to pick up the newspaper and read the newspaper. You know, what did I do today first? I looked at Facebook, right? I'm not abnormal in that way. Other ways in which I might be abnormal, that's not one of them, right? So we have to be engaged in those media in order to understand what the narrative is and who's saying what. It's another place, though, where your parents can play a huge role because they don't want people saying lies and telling bad things about the school their kid goes to. That upsets them incredibly. So they can be a huge asset in terms of fighting back that negative narrative. But if you let your opposition's definition of you sit on the table unanswered, that is the definition you become for those who don't know you. And so it's really important that you fight it back.
Thank you for the question. I think the bill that is currently pending in the legislature largely matches the initiative as far as teacher qualifications, teacher standards, and the option that, probably better stated as clarity, that teachers in a charter school have the same right to collectively bargain as any other teacher. So the legislation that currently exists would preserve that right. As newly formed entities, there is no presence of a union or a collective bargaining at the outset, but that is something that is possible if the staff elected to unionize. And they can do that either on their own, they can join an existing union as a separate bargaining unit. Any of those options remain open to them. And I think from an advocate's perspective, we're entirely agnostic, that we would absolutely support them in that. And I think just your statement around ensuring that teacher voice is a part of the debate, I think it cannot be understated. We've had some extremely powerful testimony from teachers in Olympia in just the last couple of weeks that have I believe moved votes just because it was their voice and not somebody else's. And one of I think the challenges that we have in the state of Washington is while the population of people of color continues to inch up, the general trend for teachers as a whole is to have fewer and fewer teachers of color. So as a sector, I think that is something that very early on we put as one of our priorities, is to ensure that we were doing everything we could to recruit, attract, and ultimately retain high-quality teachers of color. Right now, across the sector, we far outpace the state as a whole. We still have a ton of work to do a better job, But it's about getting great teachers into those schools, making sure that they have an environment where they want to be and that they can be retained, and then that we're ultimately elevating their voice in the same way as students and families.
So I think, if this helps, go ahead,
I
jump
can
in.
sort of dive in, maybe on both. I think as far as the collaboration with local districts, at least in Washington, it's largely been driven by local politics. I think there is a tremendous success story in Spokane of not only sort of taking the steps to do it right and be a good authorizer, but understanding that there is value in information exchange. And that's largely been possible due to an environment which encourages collaboration. There is a lot that Seattle Public Schools needs to know about educating kids. And because of the nature of local politics, notwithstanding there is a really high quality Summit High School right down the street, they're unwilling to sort of extend that same olive branch. We continue to offer, and they continue to not respond, essentially. Unfortunately, at this point, it's largely been driven by local politics. I think another success story was about to happen. One of our schools that was supposed to be opening this fall was out in Walla Walla. They were, at the time of the ruling, nearly finished with a district charter collaboration agreement that sort of spelled out roles and responsibilities around data sharing, around collaboration on PD, those opportunities that were capable of serving both sides. And so, I mean, I think as a sector, we don't anticipate that we're going to serve the majority of kids. So for us to meaningfully impact all kids, we have to find and continue to push for and fight for those opportunities wherever they may exist to open lines of communication and find out, hey, what are you guys doing well? Because there are great things happening in district schools, and we acknowledge that. We want to make sure those great things are shared with charters, and when charters are doing something right, we have to make sure there are the same avenues to make sure those practices are shared back. On the second question, I'll say this sort of as a former authorizer and now as a charter advocate. It's a tough balance, and particularly as being counsel for an authorizer. I am there to represent my client, who at that time was a board of trustees of the State University of New York, and I have a fiduciary duty back to them to make sure I am giving them all of the advice and everything that I can to the best of my ability, that many times is in conflict with some of the ideals of autonomy. The notion of sort of being able to respond to a simple question, what's the discipline rate at that school? Well, we don't require them to report that to us. Why not do it? And sort of like this notion of there are things out there that we just ought to know, and just from an authorizer, the simple act of knowing is a restriction on autonomy. And I think there's always going to be that tension there, and I think that's a role where somebody like Terry or others can sort of step in and help to broker some of those negotiations and those arrangements. And I think where, at least in my own career, where I think we've had the most success in doing that is first and foremost identifying duplication. A lot of compliance obligations and restrictions on autonomy could be taken away if state agencies or local agencies or anything like that would simply collaborate on their own to make sure they're not duplicating your efforts. You're not sending Form 1402 to the State Education Department that talks about discipline, and you're not filing Form 305 with the authorizer that asks a slightly different question that you have to answer in a slightly different way and maintain data differently. Like, let's get everybody in the room and figure out, okay, what are the obligations? What do folks really need to know? And are we all streamlined in delivering that information out? I think that streamlining process opens up a lot more autonomy and flexibility on your end, at the operator end.
So we're going to have to end. It's 3:40. We've gone 10 minutes over. I'll just say one thing on that last point. There are conversations. There are things going on. I do know the state and the authorizer, and I know Mark's been involved in these conversations. I know some of you have been involved in these conversations, this effort of trying to do away with redundancy and duplication. And this is a constant, ongoing sort of thing. Listen, I want to say thank you so much to you guys for everything that you've done and for taking time out to be here. It means a lot to us. And, you know, keep up the fight, and if we can help you out, let us know. You have our respect and admiration, and thank you so much for being here. And Todd, thank you for you being here as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.